Okay, everyone. All right, so everybody sees the downloaded notes are in the chat. If you'd like to print them out and have them in front of you, or open up another window and go back and forth. This way, we'll do it like this. Okay, we all ready to go? It's nice to see everyone. How are you guys all? Keeping warm, I hope. Okay. All right, let's begin. Okay, this is actually our 18th session in our Modern Jewish History course. Believe it or not, we've been doing this for a long time already. Yesterday, we began our final section, not our final chapter, but our final section of this particular course, which is leading into the founding of the modern state of Israel. And we began with the Holocaust. The Holocaust, of course, is in itself, as I mentioned last week, many times a topic which is bigger and more complicated and more difficult than I can possibly even pretend to be able to tackle. So what we addressed last week, we started just with a little bit, some pointers on the destruction, the travesty, the indescribable pain and suffering that the Jewish people went through, which most of us are familiar on some levels. And we began discussing just some of the timeline of the war, all of which to lead into the founding of the United Nations. The United Nations is very relevant to us in our particular story as we march towards the founding of the State of Israel, because, of course, as we know, the big votes that will take place in the UN, giving the nascent Jewish state its official permission from the nations of the world to begin. And as we concluded last week, we don't need permission to be in our homeland. That is a God-given right that we have and believe as Jews. But it is of note that we were given permission, both, as we discussed last week, the particular Gemara, the passage of the Talmud, which describes that we are not allowed to rebel against the nations, and here we did not, we were given permission. And it's just historically of note that there is no other nation in the history of the world that has had to defend its right of existence. No one, never has a nation had to defend its right, justify its right of existence the way the Jewish people have in the state of Israel. And it's always of note that of this horrible calamity called World War II, the UN was born out of that. And that's the body which actually gave us permission to found our state. Let's continue a little bit of the discussion this week of the war. Again, not focusing on the Holocaust aspect of the war, but we're going to focus on the war itself, particularly focusing on two main players, Winston Churchill, and Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of England at the time, and the roles that they have. And again, we'll focus on some of the divine nature as we can look at it from our religious Jewish set of eyeglasses as to many of the aspects and players and things that happen over the course of this particular war. So let's begin a little bit just again with Churchill and Hitler's Blitzkrieg offensive. As we are familiar with, that Poland, of course, fell in the very first month, September 1939. Hitler invades Poland, and that does not take much time at all until Poland is done away with. He invades Norway in April of 1940, so several months later, Norway is invaded and falls, and then Belgium just a month after that in May of 1940, and that crumbles also in just a matter of days. France, which was thought to be impenetrable and impassable as through the Ardennes forest, Hitler attacks them as well, and the mighty French army, which was the largest standing army in Europe at the time, is both surprised and decimated and broken in a week. And by June 22, 1940, literally 6 weeks, less than 6 weeks from the time that France is invaded, the largest standing army in Europe officially surrenders. The war already had ended even before that with France. Paris had fallen before that, but within 6 weeks' time, France has officially surrendered. The head of France, Pierre Laval, a right-wing anti-Semitic fascist, moves the seat of government from occupied Paris to the unoccupied Vichy province, and France, for all intents and purposes, is out of the war as well, which basically leaves of all the European powers, by the time not even a full year into this war, which we know is going to last 4 or 5 years, but within the first year, Poland, Norway, Belgium, France completely run over by the by the Blitzkrieg. Britain, however, which again, if you remember, we spoke about last week, which declares war on Germany immediately upon Poland being invaded, engages relatively early, the early months of the war. Churchill is appointed prime minister May 10th, 1940. So note the date. Churchill first becomes prime minister several months after the war begins. It's in September of 39 that the war begins. In May, 7-8 months later, Churchill is appointed prime minister, which happens to be the same day that Belgium was invaded, May 10th of 1940. And they continue the fight even after the fall of France. But shortly after Churchill takes over in May, their army is trapped and retreat to a port where they hope to be evacuated. The famous miracle of Dunkirk, and it's in Dunkirk between May 26th and June 4th. This is literally 2 weeks after Churchill, talk about trial by fire, 2 weeks after Churchill is appointed prime minister. They have the really unimaginable rescue. Famous books and movies have, of course, been made over this rescue at Dunkirk. 300,000 soldiers are rescued over a 10-day period of time, using every floatable boat that was available for 24 hours a day. They would run through the channel rescuing the soldiers, while thousands perished in the rescue. But again, 300,000 soldiers are rescued. In hindsight, one can actually identify this particular rescue as the beginning of the victory for the Allies. And that simply is for the reason of, it had the British fallen in Dunkirk, had they been slaughtered, which the Germans would have done gleefully on the beach of Dunkirk, that would have been a crushing and deflating defeat for the British. And it would not have been unthinkable that they might have even surrendered following that. But they survived. They managed to evacuate. Churchill, again, this is 2 weeks, literally 2 to 3 weeks into his premiership, receives a standing ovation in the House of Commons as he announces the success, and in his confident yet sober tone declares, as we'll learn many of his classic quotes, he said, "Wars are not won by evacuations." Yes, this was a success, and yes, we brought our boys home, but war is not won by a successful evacuation. And really, Churchill, more than any individual, rallies the British to war. He simply had a means of, with words, as you are all familiar, to capture the hearts and the minds with a word, with a gesture. His gift for turning a phrase, his magnificent choice of words, his grand eloquence is legendary. And in an era where the radio address was the primary means of communication between a leader and his people, people who were being bombarded, people who were under constant threat, his voice, his poetic voice, was really the rallying cry of the entire free world, as he has correctly been given great credit for. I mentioned here a couple of quotes. It's worth it just to share. His probably most famous is when he begins this campaign: "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Another quote of his: "Success is not final," he said, "nor is failure fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." And he had a way, again, the war drags on, 1940, 41, 42, 43, 44. The ability to have the courage to continue is really that which matters most. "All the greatest things," he said, "are simple, and many can be expressed in a single word: freedom, justice, honor, duty, mercy, and hope. These are the greatest concepts that we have, and they're concepts worth fighting for." And one of my personal favorites, he said, "You have enemies," he said. "Good. That means that you have stood up. That means you have stood up for something in your life. Otherwise, you would not have any enemies." So now that we have it on the screen here in front of us, thank you very much, Hody, for taking care of that, or Naftali, whoever it is that's doing that. We are now here. If you see my cursor, my pointer, E, "It is not in our power to anticipate our destiny." Great quote from Winston Churchill. We can't anticipate our destiny. Our destiny is. It just hits us. And then the only question is, will we stand up and take the reins and do what it is that needs to be done or not? And that quote is really what I wanted to lead into Rabbi Wein as I've quoted him many, many times, Rabbi Berelwein, when he discusses Winston Churchill and his role in the war, uses him as an example of how the Almighty chooses a person and nurtures him just for the right moments. And that for decades, Churchill was actually in the political wilderness in Britain. He was the odd man out even as late as 1938. And yet, incredibly, he became the person who led the free world. Remember, the US doesn't join until late 1941 with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and Britain was alone in being able to stand up to Germany. Russia, of course, is on the Eastern Front, Britain on the Western Front. And what was one of the most amazing things, and as we'll see as we continue our post-war, those last 3 years, as I mentioned last week, we're about to discuss a lot, from 45 to 48, a major fertile ground for the development, obviously, of the state of Israel. That period of time is not going to be Winston Churchill, because he is voted out immediately upon the end of war. As many historians have noticed, one of the most ironic thank yous to one of the great leaders of the free world during one of the most trying moments in world history, the fight against Hitler, which he stood up for and led England in its fights. Immediately after the war, the British citizens vote him out. He loses to Clement Attlee, and we'll discuss a little bit more about him and his role, Attlee's role, in the founding of the state of Israel when we get there. Letter C, the Battle of Britain. As Hitler considers his plans for the invasion of England, the German Air Force tries to crush the British into submission through air power. It becomes known as the Battle of Britain. And London is heavily bombed for months and months, and the British sustain tremendous civilian casualties. This becomes a rallying point and stiffens the British resolve. Those of you who like the contemporary popular writer Malcolm Gladwell, so he has two different books. In one of his books, he discusses at length just the experience of how psychologists have studied that when the bombs would fall and you would pick yourself up and survive, how each time that happened and you weren't killed or harmed, it somehow stiffened your resolve, like, I'll always be okay. And how psychologists use a lot about the raids on London in measuring how people responded to things like that. And then he actually wrote a second book about different tactics of bombings during the Second World War. But under Churchill's leadership, the London civilians stuck it out, despite heavy casualties and the flattening of their great city. Against all odds, the British Air Force successfully defeats the German Air Force, which would never recover. In the immortal words again of Churchill, describing the British Air Force's ability to ward off the German Air Force, never in the history of mankind have so many owed so much to so few. Really a brilliant comment of the pilots of the Royal Air Force, and the debt of gratitude that was owed by so many to so few of them, in being able to do so. And one of his other quotes, which I didn't bring here in the notes, how he described how this is a war fought by nameless soldiers who are sacrificing everything for everything that we stand for, that which is good and that which is true. And really was again, as you know, we as Jews are so, it's just the way that is enmeshed in the Holocaust part of World War II, which of course makes sense. We are, those of us who are descendants of survivors, it's just part of how we see history. And there was an entire war being fought, again, as we mentioned last week, separate from the atrocities of the Holocaust that were being fought. And in that, one has to certainly give credit where credit is due, and that goes to those who fought the battle. And we'll see in a moment, when we talk about Roosevelt in a second, how much Roosevelt wanted to avoid making this a Jewish war. It was not in his best interest, he felt. He wanted to separate the fact that the Jews were experiencing the atrocity they were doing. We have a war to fight against Hitler. And whatever Hitler was doing, that's not why we're fighting this war. We're fighting it because we need to protect freedom. And as Jews, that's part of the story, which we'll get to in a moment, of the complicated dynamic of the American Jewish community, how the American Jewish community till this day views Roosevelt and his role in the war. And as we shift into that, but just completing our part on Churchill, who led the British campaign, which was a major significant part of the campaign. The British victory in the Battle of Britain meant that Germany's plan for an invasion of England was going to be scrapped, meaning they succeeded in stopping Germany from physically invading a ground invasion onto the island of England. And even though they were isolated, still they became a dangerous foe for the Nazi Empire's Western Front, and they held their ground. France, Belgium, Poland, Norway, all of those countries fell, and Britain was able to, and that was obviously a major a boost. In June of 1941, just to tie up what we spoke about last week, Hitler launches his offensive into Russia, which, as we mentioned, that is going to stall. He launches the offensive in June, it's summertime, and as that war drags into the frigid Russian winter, they are overextended and unprepared, and that really is the beginning of the end. So like three major events are going to happen there in June, July, August of 41. The first is Britain being able to ward off the German air raids on the city of London and survive. Two, of course, is not Hitler launching his Nazi offensive into Russia, which, as this winter drags on, will decimate the German army and their supply lines. And then the three, of course, is, as we'll get to, in December of 41, the bombing of Pearl Harbor will bring the U.S. into the war. Those three things, England surviving, the U.S. entry, and Russia being able to withstand the attack on their land because of the Russian winter and the overextended lines, will turn the tide. And it's just interesting to note, again, as I find we're sitting in the pandemic, like 2 years, this is forever. We could talk about the war turning in the winter of 41, but the war doesn't end until May 1945, even though historically you can look back and say, this is where it's going to turn. Still, the battle drags on all of 42, 43, 44. It's not until the end of 44 and spring of 45 do we actually get to the end of this horrible war. Moving on a little bit to Franklin Roosevelt, again, not to give a history of FDR nor of his role, but just as it relates to our Jewish story and the development of the state of Israel. Meanwhile, during this time in the US, Roosevelt may have recognized Hitler for the threat that he was, but the bottom line was he had very strong public sentiment that was opposed to war. Timing-wise, FDR is inaugurated. He wins the election of 1932. He's inaugurated in January of 1933, 5 weeks after Hitler is appointed chancellor. So they were literally beginning their reigns together. Hitler in Germany in late 32 and in early 33, FDR begins his presidency. He's going to be president for an unprecedented 4 terms. He will not survive his 4th term, but he is elected for 4 different terms from 1932, again in 36 and 40, and he wins the election in 44. The reasons why he did not want to engage in what was going on in Europe is because he felt it was Europe's war. All of Europe is fighting each other. Let them fight each other. What does that have to do with us? The Great War had only happened, the First World War, 20 years prior. The U.S. had absolutely no interest in getting involved in this particular war. Remember, of course, as well, they are coming out and dealing with a Great Recession. FDR takes over 1929, the Great Recession. He wins the election in 1932. His New Deal, his only concern is local, domestic, economic reform, getting the U.S. back to the place in which it was. We will talk about this in a moment as well. We'll mention it now. We've spoken about the immigration laws of 1924. The U.S., before FDR takes over, already had imposed harsh immigration restrictions. They did not want immigrants coming over from Europe. It was not an anti-Semitic law, although it did affect us greatly. They didn't want the immigrants at all. They were not interested. The U.S. was not an open door policy in any way, shape, or form. Now, as the war breaks out now in 1939, that's all just a little bit of the background of what the environment that he was stepping into. They didn't want to admit as well how global this conflict was. They wanted to be, it's a conflict in Europe. Leave it in Europe, leave us alone. We don't want to engage in it. And as often is the case, as history teaches us, that which you might think if you just close your eyes and look the other way won't impact you. It's not on my doorstep now, so I'll leave it. But like so many things, you think you can leave it out there, but it's going to enter your door, into your home, and find its way into your life, whether you like it or not. And certainly that was the case with Hitler and World War II. Politically speaking, the isolationists in America wielded great power during this time. And these isolationists who, again, wanted nothing to do with the war, are aided by rampant anti-Semitism in the United States. We've spoken about when we spoke about the U.S. a couple of weeks ago as well. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and those of us, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the plight of the Jew coming over from Europe in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it was not a welcoming place, not just for the immigrants who came over, for Jews who had been here for many, many years. Many of the famous law firms, hospitals, medical schools today, which are Jewish. The reason why they are Jewish is because the Jew couldn't get into any other law school, doctor, couldn't be a hospital, get into a hospital, couldn't get into a medical school. The country clubs were no Jews, no dogs, and no blacks. That's the way that it was in the US. And that attitude furthered the hesitancy of FDR and the general American public to want to get involved. Charles Kaufman, a popular radio host, Christian figure, would regularly rant against the Jews and praise Hitler. The German-American Bund would march in the street, and there's a very famous rally in MSG, Madison Square Garden. There are pictures of them you can find online very quickly. I think the numbers were close to 20,000 people showed up in MSG. They have pictures of the banners, the Nazi banners hanging from the rafters of MSG during this rally in the late 30s in support of Nazi Germany. Now, Roosevelt positioned himself for war as much as possible, meaning trying to avoid it, but knowing that it was coming, promoted the peacetime draft. He would send military supplies to the Allies. His Lend-Lease program gave England 50 American destroyers, although it's very possible that the psychological benefit of him supporting them was far more important than the old ships that he actually supplied. But there was a beginning to engage without ever actually formally engaging. As I mentioned, he breaks with tradition and runs for an unprecedented fourth term and wins. His fourth term running mate in 1944 is Harry Truman, who we will speak about in a moment. Really something that no president before or since has done. And he felt, he was God's instrument. He was in the right time, in the right place, and he was going to see us through this war. The day of infamy is when the U.S., of course, joins into World War II, December 7th, 1941, which is, noting the calendar, of course, 2 full years after the war has begun. September 1939, Hitler invades Poland. It's not till December 1941, and it wasn't that the U.S. decided to go in. They were literally pulled by the collar and dragged in with the famous bombing on Pearl Harbor, Japan, which is an ally of Germany, and one can discuss which is not our topic, why in the world did they provoke the bear? What did Japan want in bombing the U.S. fleet in Pearl Harbor? But they were certainly economically provoked and frightened for their own interests, and believed that it was in their best interest to either drag America in or try to do whatever kind of damage that they can with a surprise attack on the Pacific Fleet stationed in Pearl Harbor, which of course completely shocked, surprised, galvanized the Americans to immediately declare war on Japan. And as we mentioned last week, the US does not declare war on Germany. But Hitler, as an ally of Japan, does. And when the US declares war on Japan, Hitler declares war on the US, which in turn, Congress declares war on Germany, and the official world war bringing the US in is on. Churchill writes in his memoirs that night, December 7th, 1941, for the first time in 8 years, he goes to sleep knowing that the Western world will be saved from Hitler. And it is, again, just historically a point of interest. It is a fascinating historical note. When you think about, again, as we mentioned a few moments ago, the big 3 events as to the demise, the turn of the war, the British's ability to sustain themselves, to survive the onslaught and remain a formidable foe. And then the other 2 major events was Hitler's attack on Russia, which was an ally of his in the beginning of the war, as we spoke about last week as well. And then he breaks that pact and he attacks and he goes deep into Russia, way beyond his supply lines and Winter can manage. So there himself, he was the cause, so to speak, of his own ruin. And then even had Japan attacked the US wanted nothing to do with Germany. The US wanted nothing to do with the European theater. They didn't want to engage. Japan attacked us, we're going to take out Japan. But it was only that Hitler couldn't tolerate, he declares war on the US declares war back on Hitler, and that engages them into the European theater, which of course eventually will totally turn the tide. The addition of the US troops, their supplies, their resources, their military power will, in conjunction with everything else going on, will eventually be his own demise. And really just a fascinating historical fact as to how that plays itself out. Of course, we're making it much more simple than it is, but the basics are as that is. For our purposes, we're going to skip from 1942, 43, 44, the actual details of the war. As I mentioned last week, this is not a course, nor am I a World War II scholar on the different battles. Those who are interested, of course, are welcome to look into it. For our purposes, we're going to fast forward once we've introduced the U.S. to February, March of 1945, the war has finally come to an end. Hitler commits suicide at the end of April 1945, and Germany officially surrenders May 7, 1945 is the end of the war in Europe. As I mentioned last week, also, Jews, I don't want to over stereotype. When did the war end? The war ended when Germany finally, when Hitler kills himself and Germany surrenders the war. Well, that's when the European theater ended, but the US was still at war with Japan at that point, and that war will continue until the 2 atomic bombs are dropped, which we'll get to in a moment. Before we get to that, let's just take a step back and address one of the most hotly debated aspects of this time of this aspect of Jewish history, and that is the role Roosevelt and the relationship between Roosevelt and the Jews. A very politically charged question. Was Roosevelt indeed a friend of the Jews or a foe? Was he a help or a passive murderer in allowing the Jews to go to their deaths in mass? This question is, as I said, a really politically charged question, and one in which numerous books, articles, films, and documentaries have been produced trying to get to the bottom of what indeed is the relationship between Roosevelt and the Jewish people. I'm certainly not going to come to a definitive conclusion in that, but just to share some of the details in this. You will find books by the title, entire books on both sides. Those who say, the saving of the Jews, is a title of the book in terms of how Roosevelt was the savior and all that he did to save the Jews, and the versus books that are entitled, I forget exactly, I'm blanking on the name, the destruction of the Jews, turning their back on the Jews, and how Roosevelt was the guilty party for not doing what he could have done. Just a few years ago, Harvard University put out a book with a Parv title, FDR and the Jews. And their goal of the two Harvard historians was to just paint a non-color. Many of the books already have an agenda, before you even read the first page as to what their role is. They just wanted to paint as many facts as possible, show all the places that FDR actually helped and all the places where he could have, should have done more. Some of the major points of debate in his role, of course, is 3 or 4 just famous ones, is the St. Louis, of course, which we're all familiar with. 937 Jewish German refugees are turned away from Cuba, from the US in the spring of 1939. It would have required an executive act from Roosevelt to allow them in. The law was they could not have come in. There were harsh immigration laws in place at the time, and he did not do whatever he could have, which he could have done, to allow them in. Those who are interested, if you'd like, you could just simply Google St. Louis and Roosevelt, and you will see all long articles on all of the political issues going on at the time that would make such a decision complicated. We look at it, obviously, as those are our family members. They needed a place to go. How could you not let them in? And that's obviously the way that we're always going to see that. If you're objective, which we are not, and I'm not asking us to be, we shouldn't be. But a political scientist looking at the event in 1939, not understanding it as they did not in 1939, the extent of what was going on in Europe at the time. I'm sure there were reports, but it was not yet to the degree where anybody fully understood and all that was going on. But that's certainly one of the major events that will always be affiliated, a black mark, so to speak, on Roosevelt's treating of the Jews. And of course, at the end of the war was the Allied refusal to bomb Auschwitz. Why is that not happening? Why didn't it happen? Couldn't they just have dropped a few bombs on the railroads, on the trains, on the camp itself? It could have saved unknown thousands and thousands of people. That's the argument against Roosevelt, who certainly could have ordered it. When you just look at the point in time where it would have even been possible to have bombed Auschwitz would have been already deep into 1944, where unfortunately most of the carnage and damage and murder had already taken place, and there are political answers to that as well. Just to go through some of the other issues that he was involved in over the course of this particular time, there were very strong immigration laws, as we've mentioned. Now, they preceded him, but he didn't do anything to do that. He did not repeal, for example, there was a condition in order to be within the immigration law. So there was a quota that you were allowed to allow in from different countries. But within the quota of what you were allowed to let in, there was a provision of an individual who was likely to become a public charge. Meaning, if a person didn't have a means to support themselves, was not going to be able to get a job and was going to become a burden on the public, they can have their visa application rejected. We don't want you to become a burden on the public. So even though we haven't yet filled the quota from whatever country you're applying from, we're going to reject you anyway because we don't want to become a burden. As the late 30s turning into the 40s, they did not even fulfill the quotas that they had from Germany because the applicants were deemed to not be able to support themselves. And so they were rejected even from within a quota that they could have been an acceptable number, but he never repealed that clause even as things worsened in Nazi Germany throughout the 30s. And the percentage, it never even filled the quota. There were many years in which they didn't even fulfill the quota. That is certainly also a charge that is made against Roosevelt. There was a 1939 bill introduced in Congress, supported by his own wife publicly, to allow 20,000 German children, refugee children, into the US, and it never made it even to a vote on the Congress floor. A bill which was publicly supported by his wife Eleanor did not make it. And again, when these are all part of the things that are against him. There was, as the political analysts point out, a tremendous fear of spies and of immigrants in general, meaning when you open up the gates of immigration, and again, we as Jews, these are our family members that were not allowed in, so it's just enraging that the US kept its doors closed, justifiably so, obviously, but there was a fear of immigration. People did not like waves and waves of immigrants coming. And particularly in that era, there was a fear of spies that within, if you opened up the doors and you allowed entire boats of immigrants to come in and you didn't go through the process and you didn't know who they were, they couldn't prove their identities, which the Jews in Europe could not. Who knows how many spies of Germany and of Japan, as the war went on, are amongst them. And that was a real thing. It was a real concern and a fear of spies and immigrants. There was also a great, fierce political opposition of being isolationist, as we mentioned, and not wanting to be accused of fighting a Jewish war. Roosevelt was very concerned. This is, we always have this debate when you have a friend of the Jew in office, or even a Jew himself. This came up, if you remember, it's going back already now, 20 years, when Lieberman ran for president. Is that good or bad? Does a Jewish person in office have to bend over backwards to not be good to the Jews, to not make everything a Jewish issue? So Roosevelt was very concerned of being accused of engaging in a Jewish war. He didn't want that. He didn't want it because he didn't want it, and he also thought it'd be bad for his own politics and bad for everybody. He was focused on domestic problems, on the economy, on coming out of the Great Depression. What he does do, which again, a lot of scholars point to, is he eventually does establish, not till January of 1944, the War Refugee Board. By this point, the refugee crisis is a massive crisis in Europe. This is 5 years into the war. The refugee situation is completely out of control. So it got to be so bad that he could not ignore it. And he establishes the War Refugee Board, which calculated, I saw different numbers, tens of thousands of lives they claim to have saved. The Harvard scholars say that they themselves, the War Refugee Board, claimed to have saved 200,000 Jews, which they themselves, and again, this Harvard book, FDR and the Jews, say even if it's double the accuracy, they saved 100,000, that would be quite a record. And even if it's a quarter, if they save 50,000 Jews, it's a record. So quite a record. But he does get credit for eventually establishing that particular board. Two final historical notes on FDR and the role that he plays in these war years. In 1944, Congress drafts a bill in support of a Jewish homeland. Again, in 1917, as we're familiar with, the Balfour Declaration already is on record as His King's Majesty looking with favor on the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Congress drafts a bill similar in style in 1944. We, again, just to take a step back, we have left out Palestine. The last time we discussed Palestine was in the late 20s and early 30s. We're going to have to get back to Palestine after we finish our discussion of the war, because there's a lot going on in Palestine. But in 1944, with all that's taking place in Palestine, Congress adopts a bill in support of the founding of the state. And they reject it. They pull it off of the table because FDR pressured them. He was afraid of disrupting the Arab balance in the war that he was fighting against the Nazis. And now that he had entered the war and they're fighting the Nazis, they were about to win, he didn't want to disrupt that whole balance because the Arabs were always sort of aligned. They didn't have an army that they were fighting with. I don't believe at that time, but didn't want it. They were the numbers were great, and therefore the Congress does not establish that, and that's at FDR's pressuring them. In 1945, shortly before he dies, he assures the Arabs that the U.S. would not intervene in Palestine without consulting both the Jews and the Arabs in that region, which his successor Truman will reject. FDR gave him the promise. We will not involve, we will not get involved, we will not do anything or insert ourselves without consulting all sides and making sure that things are great. Truman will support the state. He's going to be the first president, of course, and the first world leader right after the state of Israel declares its independence to lend his support. We'll talk more about that, God willing, in the right time. So that's just one interesting historical note in terms of Congress and support of the state of Israel and where FDR fell on that, which was on the wrong side. He dies in office on April 12th, 1945. Remember, it was 1944 is his fourth term. So he begins that term in January 1945. He lasts 4 months into his fourth term, and he dies on April 12th, rather suddenly and unexpectedly in Georgia. That day, the day that he dies, April 12th, is the day, the famous day that Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley tour the recently liberated Ohrdruf concentration camp. And that's all that famous footage that we have of the US soldiers arriving for the first time and seeing what a concentration camp was, the piles of the body, the emaciated survivors. And that scene, those pictures, the live video, is taken on the day that Roosevelt dies. He never lives to see the reality of the horrors of that which was taking place. And so he never even has a moment of, oh, that really what was going on. All he had was all of the, the Jews trying to bang down his door to get him to bomb this and to take care of that, which he, in many instances, rejected. But he never does live to actually see that particular footage, and that is just an interesting historical note that he dies on that day that they tour the camp. With his death, which is still, remember, April 12th is a month prior to Germany's surrender. The war is already a foregone conclusion, but Germany has not yet surrendered in April, and the war with Japan is going to continue until the bombs drop in August. So we're still in the midst of a war, and the sitting president for the last 12 years dies. And who takes over? His vice president, Harry Truman. Harry Truman is a little-known senator from Missouri. As Rabbi Wein likes to say, another one of God's accidents. He was originally chosen for the ticket simply because he was going to be the least damaging running mate to allow FDR to achieve this unprecedented fourth victory. He was like a no one, didn't have major things that would rub people the wrong way, and he is thrust into the national spotlight, promoted to the most powerful position in the world towards the end of the war, and finds himself in this particular seat. This is of great interest to our particular thread that we are following, the founding of the State of Israel, in which FDR, at this moment of Allied victory, he's literally a month from victory, is removed from this world. He dies, and Truman now becomes the president. After Truman becomes the president, he is informed of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project, which had begun, I believe it was a full 3 years prior, the famous secret project to develop the atomic bomb. He knows nothing about it as vice president, had never heard of it. He was not in the know. It was a very small circle of people who were aware of it. And now, all of a sudden, he becomes in charge of this massive project, which already had billions of dollars, billions we're talking about going back to the 1940s. A massive amount of money had been invested in the development of this bomb. I mentioned I read a book just a couple of weeks ago describing the countdown from the time that Truman takes over till the 117 days until the bombs are dropped, in which he needs to be informed. They need to do all the testing, and then they need to decide. He needs to decide, having had no idea about anything, about all the money, scientists, entire city that was built out in the desert of Arizona and Las Vegas, just knowing nothing. And now he's in charge of making a decision of, are we actually going to carry this out? Are we going to drop such a bomb on the Japanese? The Japanese soldiers had already established themselves as people of no surrender. They were warriors. That had begun. Remember that the U.S. is fighting Japan since December of 1941. That Pacific theater, battles on various islands all throughout the Pacific had taken place, and the Japanese fought to the death. That was well known. They were brutal and they were warriors. And since the U.S. had established as a given, once you attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. said, we will also not stop until there's an unconditional surrender. That created a terrible dilemma for Truman. As the war in the European theater comes to an end with Germany's surrender, they had already become accustomed to the way of the Japanese battles and the fights. And that was never on Japanese homeland. The Japanese would fight to the death and never surrender. So his military analyst said, what's it going to be like when we invade the actual island of Japan? How are they going to fight? Forget just the soldiers. How are the civilians going to manage this? And the estimates that Truman was given was easy 500,000 American dead, easy between 500 and 100 and a million injured prisoners. Those were the numbers that he was told. Without question, were going to be the casualties of the land invasion. And the U.S. not invading and just sort of giving up without achieving surrender was not an option after Pearl Harbor. And that was the rock and the hard place that he found himself in. Now, what do we do? And with the scientists telling him that the bomb is ready and it's capable, and they had tested it out in the desert, he made a very simple equation. And he said, we might kill several 100,000 Japanese, but I'm not willing to sacrifice 1 million U.S. soldiers. That's my responsibility. My responsibility are the U.S. soldiers, and I'm not willing to sacrifice up to 1 million U.S. soldiers if I can sacrifice instead some of our enemies. And that was the simplified a decision in dropping a massive bomb, which changes world history, through which, again, the two targets that they chose, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were heavily militarized areas. It is obviously also well documented that they were substantial civilian populations, but they were not pure civilian cities. There was major military bases in those areas. And he authorized the two bombs over both Hiroshima, followed by Nagasaki. That itself, of course, is a study onto how that changed the world political landscape once the U.S. did that. Also a fascinating note, the U.S., this bastion of freedom and of all that it represents in the Western world, all the enemies of the U.S. say, you're the ones who dropped the two atomic bombs in the history of the world, which of course is true. You can't argue with that fact. Again, Truman did so in order to spare upwards of 500,000, close to 1 million U.S. lives that the war would have otherwise taken. And in August of 1945, the war with Japan comes to an end. As far as this goes, in terms of getting us to where we are, the fact that Truman is now in office is of great importance. We mentioned that FDR specifically rejected a bill in Congress to be supportive of a Jewish homeland. He was very interested in making sure that the Arab and the Jews were invested in every step of the way, and he would not do anything with one without the other. Truman takes a different approach. Truman, shortly after taking office, appoints several experts to study the Palestinian issue. And in May of 46, just under a year following the end of the war, he announces his approval of a recommendation to admit 100,000 displaced persons into Palestine, that they should go in. Remember, England, we're going to get back to all of this, where England is in charge and they don't want nothing to do anymore with Palestine. And in October of 46, publicly declares his support for the creation of a Jewish state. The final story that we will share, I'm not even going to tell the whole story now because it requires more than what we have right now. All of this was to set up that Truman is now in office as we get through the war years in the beginning of the state. One of the most famous legends, which legend almost makes it imply like it's not true. I'd like to share when we start. We're going to start next week with sharing the full story from the book "The Prime Ministers," written by somebody help me. It's on the tip of my tongue. Yehuda Avner. Yehuda Avner wrote, if you haven't read The Prime Ministers yet, you must. It's a thick, it looks like an overwhelming book, but it is an awesome, awesome read of the history of the founding of the State of Israel and Yehuda Avner's work as a diplomat alongside many of its prime ministers. Yehuda Avner tells the story of when Levi Eshkol sent him to Independence, Missouri, to hand deliver a letter to Harry Truman thanking him for his support. And in his book, he tells the story. Okay, I'll probably tell most of it now. I can't help myself. In his book, he tells the story how Yehuda Avner is telling the first-hand account, how he was an aide to Levi Eshkol, and he delivers a letter from Levi Eshkol to Harry Truman in his home, and they're taking a walk together. And Harry Truman recounts the story how in 1947, Chaim Weizmann was trying to get an audience with him to address some of the major issues gaining support for the founding of the State of Israel. And we'll do this again next week, or when the time comes to when we get up to 1947. And Truman says, I had it with the Zionists. I didn't want to hear from them. They were making me crazy. They were making every issue into a Zionist issue. I'm running the US. I'm not running the land of Palestine. And I didn't want to see another pro-Zionist person. I had shut my door to them. I was finished. And my old friend, Eddie Jacobson, who was a childhood friend, they went into business together, they fought in World War I together. Eddie Jacobson shows up unannounced in President Truman's office in Washington. And as Truman recounts the story himself to Yehuda Avner, he said, Eddie and I never got into a fight, not in any of our days, not in the Great War, not in our failed business, not in all of our years, except this one time when Eddie barges into my office to get me to speak to Chaim Weizmann. And I told him, Eddie, I'm done. I don't want to see or hear from another one. And Eddie points to a picture or painting that I had in my office of Stonewall Jackson, who was my personal hero. I had read many books about him, the American general, and he said, "That's your hero? My hero is Chaim Weizmann, and he is fighting for the survival of my people, and you have to see him." And he describes Yehuda Avner in much more dramatic sense than I am right now, the standoff in his office, and to where Harry Truman eventually says, "Fine, let him in." And he says, we ended up meeting for an hour, and it was Weizmann's eloquence and the person that he was, and his passion and his commitment that got a promise out of Truman that he was going to support the founding of the state. And when Ben-Gurion was ready to declare the new states, Truman says to Yehuda Avner, "I knew that my State Department would never let me get away with it. I knew that all my Harvard graduates and white shirts and ties in the State Department would never let it happen. I sent a telegram to them less than 30 minutes prior to Ben-Gurion's announcement that they should send out a telegram saying, 'We support the state of Israel,' so that nobody had any time to address that. And all of that was because of Chaim Weizmann. And the fact that I saw Chaim Weizmann was because Eddie Jacobson told me that I had to." And as Rabbi Wein would say, in the divine scheme of things, that FDR should die, and Truman, who was a no-name, should have never been on the ticket, should have never become the president of the US, was in the White House that year, and his childhood Jewish friend, Eddie Jacobson, you call it a legend because you almost can't believe it, except that Truman himself tells the story, had a major part of the mechanisms behind the support that the US gave to the new state of Israel, which was no small sign of support at the time, as we'll get to. All of this just to go through again some of the major players during the war years, for Churchill and Roosevelt, and how both of their terms come to an end right at the end of the war. And we'll talk more about England's role, of course, from 45 to 48, because they're, of course, the power in charge, and all that will go into that as they eventually pack up and leave. And the US's role, just a fascinating point in history. Again, just acknowledging we haven't really addressed the Holocaust. We can't, I can't, it's too big. So I have to acknowledge that I'm not acknowledging it. We're really dancing around the Jewish aspect of that, the main role, and just talking about the war and how some of this will have an impact on the founding of the state. And of course, we will still have to address how so many of the refugees and survivors of the war, of course, come to the land of Palestine and the role that they will play. So we'll cover it from that angle as well, God willing, as we continue along. But for now, we'll call it a day with that. And God willing, we will pick up next week with some more aspects of World War II and moving into this final period of the founding of the state. All right.